September morning mist clung to the weathered headstones of St. Mary's churchyard like reluctant spirits, and Miss Jane Marple adjusted her black gloves with the same careful attention she paid to all of life's small ceremonies. She had arrived in the village of Bramley Cross only 3 days earlier to visit her great-niece, but already the peaceful hamlet had provided her with something far more intriguing than the promised rest cure her doctor had prescribed: the funeral of Mr. Charles Ashworth had drawn nearly every resident of Bramley Cross, their dark-clad figures creating a sombre tableau against the ancient stones. Mr. Ashworth had been the village's most prominent citizen, a retired banker whose generous donations had funded the new church roof, and whose opinions on local matters carried considerable weight. His sudden death from what Dr. Pembroke had termed acute cardiac failure had shocked the community, though perhaps not entirely surprised those who had observed his increasingly erratic behaviour in recent weeks. Miss Marple positioned herself strategically near the lich gate, her keen blue eyes taking in every detail of the assembled mourners. At the graveside stood Mrs. Helena Ashworth, the widow whose behaviour had already become the subject of considerable village speculation. She was a handsome woman of 52, with silver-streaked auburn hair and the kind of refined features that suggested good breeding and careful maintenance. Her black dress was impeccably tailored, her posture erect, and her expression one of dignified composure. What struck Miss Marple as remarkable, and what had evidently struck the entire village as deeply suspicious, was Mrs. Ashworth's complete absence of visible grief. Throughout the service she had not shed a single tear. Her hands remained steady, her voice clear when responding to the liturgy, and her face bore no trace of the ravages that profound sorrow typically inflicts upon the bereaved. She stood like a figure carved from marble, beautiful and utterly unmoved. The contrast with the other mourners was stark. Miss Celia Morrison, Mr. Ashworth's secretary of 15 years, dabbed constantly at her eyes with a sodden handkerchief. Young Timothy Ashworth, the deceased's nephew and heir, struggled visibly with his emotions, his shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. Even Mrs. Bantry, who had known the Ashworths only socially, appeared more affected by the proceedings than the widow herself. Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the small group of people standing closest to Mrs. Ashworth. Dr. Pembroke, a distinguished gentleman with silver hair and kind eyes, kept casting concerned glances at the widow, clearly puzzled by her demeanour. Beside him stood Mr. Geoffrey Whitman, the family solicitor, a thin, nervous man who seemed more interested in studying his pocket watch than in the proceedings. Most intriguingly, there was Mrs. Violet Ashworth, Charles's sister-in-law, whose sharp features bore an expression of barely concealed disapproval as she watched Helena's performance. As Reverend Matthews concluded the graveside service with the traditional words about dust and resurrection, Miss Marple observed a curious exchange. Mrs. Violet Ashworth leaned close to Helena and whispered something that caused the widow's composure to flicker just for an instant. Helena's response was too quiet to overhear, but the effect on Violet was immediate. Her face flushed with what appeared to be anger or frustration. The mourners began to disperse, many heading toward Ashworth House, where a reception had been arranged. Miss Marple lingered, ostensibly to examine the floral tributes, but actually to observe the final interactions at the graveside. She noticed that Helena Ashworth paused for a long moment beside her husband's grave, not in apparent grief, but with the air of someone completing a necessary task. When she finally turned away, Miss Marple caught sight of her expression, and what she saw there was not sorrow, but something that looked remarkably like relief. "Shocking, isn't it?" The voice belonged to Mrs. Clement, the village postmistress, who had appeared at Miss Marple's elbow with the stealth of someone accustomed to gathering information. "That woman hasn't shown a proper emotion since Charles collapsed in his study. You'd think she'd lost a pet canary, not a husband of 25 years. Miss Marple murmured something appropriately sympathetic while filing away this information. Mrs. Clement, she had already discovered, was a reliable source of village intelligence, though her interpretations required careful filtering. "Of course," Mrs. Clement continued, lowering her voice conspiratorially, "there are those who say Charles hadn't been himself lately. Drinking more than usual, staying up all hours in that study of his, muttering about papers and accounts. Some think the strain of his business affairs finally caught up with him. How very sad," Miss Marple replied gently, though I suppose such pressures do take their toll. Was Mr. Ashworth having financial difficulties? Mrs. Clement's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of someone possessed of particularly choice gossip. Well, I couldn't say for certain, but there have been whispers. Young Timothy mentioned something to the vicar about his uncle being terribly worried about some investments. And then there's the matter of that argument Charles had with Mr. Whitman just last week. Voices raised right there in the High Street, if you can imagine such a thing. Miss Marple filed away these details with the same methodical care she applied to her knitting patterns. In her long experience, she had learned that the most revealing information often came not from dramatic revelations, but from the accumulation of small, seemingly insignificant details that others overlooked or dismissed. As they walked slowly toward the church gate, Miss Marple's attention was caught by a small scene playing out near the war memorial. Helena Ashworth was speaking quietly with Miss Morrison, the secretary, and even from a distance the conversation appeared tense. Miss Morrison's face was flushed and her hands moved in agitated gestures that suggested distress or disagreement. Helena, by contrast, remained perfectly composed, her voice too low to carry, but her posture suggesting firm authority. The exchange ended abruptly when Timothy Ashworth approached and Miss Morrison hurried away, her handkerchief once again pressed to her eyes. Helena turned to her nephew with the same serene expression she had maintained throughout the morning, placing a gloved hand briefly on his arm in what appeared to be a gesture of comfort. Miss Marple paused to retie her shoelace, a useful subterfuge that allowed her to observe without appearing to do so. She noticed that Timothy's response to his aunt's touch was curious. He seemed to recoil slightly, as if her contact was unwelcome. When Helena moved away toward the waiting funeral car, Timothy remained by the memorial, his young face troubled and uncertain. "Strange business, all of it," Mrs. Clement remarked as they reached the gate. "Mark my words, Miss Marple, there's more to Charles Ashworth's death than meets the eye. A man doesn't just drop dead in his prime without reason, and a wife doesn't fail to weep at his funeral without cause." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her mind already beginning to sort and categorize the morning's observations. In her experience, when human behavior departed significantly from expected patterns, there was usually a compelling reason. The widow who refused to weep was indeed an intriguing puzzle, and Miss Marple found herself looking forward to discovering what secrets lay beneath Helena Ashworth's marble composure. As she walked slowly back toward her great-niece's cottage, Miss Marple reflected on the morning's events. The funeral had raised more questions than it had answered, and she suspected that Bramley Cross was about to become a far more interesting place than anyone had anticipated. The reception at Ashworth House concluded with the same restrained propriety that had marked the funeral service, guests departing with murmured condolences and meaningful glances. By the following afternoon, however, the village's collective need to discuss, dissect, and theorize had reached a fever pitch. Miss Marple found herself the beneficiary of this social phenomenon when her great-niece Diana arranged an informal tea-gathering at Rosemary Cottage, ostensibly to help her become acquainted with the local ladies. The assembled company represented the very heart of Bramley Cross society. Mrs. Bantry held court from the largest armchair, her purple dress a defiant splash of colour against the day's lingering solemnity. Mrs. Clement had positioned herself strategically near the tea service, ensuring she would catch every whispered "confidence." Miss Weatherby, the retired headmistress, sat with military precision, while Mrs. Price from the bakery and young Mrs. Foster completed the circle of eager discussants. "I simply cannot fathom it," Mrs. Bantry declared, accepting her second slice of Victoria sponge with the air of someone settling in for a lengthy discourse. Helena Ashworth stood at that graveside like a marble statue. Not a tear, not a tremor, nothing. It was positively unnatural. Mrs. Clement's teacup rattled against its saucer as she nodded vigorously. Unnatural is precisely the word. When my Herbert passed, God rest his soul, I was inconsolable for weeks. But Helena? She might have been attending a parish council meeting for all the emotion she showed. Miss Marple's knitting needles maintained their gentle rhythm, but her keen blue eyes missed nothing as she observed the animated faces around her. Each woman, she noted, seemed to have her own theory about the widow's peculiar composure. Perhaps, Miss Weatherby suggested, with the measured tone of someone accustomed to examining evidence, we should consider that people grieve differently. Some individuals are naturally more reserved in their emotional expressions. Reserved? Mrs. Price's voice rose an octave. Miss Weatherby, with respect, there's reserved and there's inhuman. I saw Helena at the post office yesterday morning, the very day after Charles died, and she was discussing flower arrangements as calmly as if she were planning a garden party. Mrs. Foster, who had remained quiet until now, leaned forward conspiratorially. My Harold mentioned something rather disturbing. He said Charles had been coming to the bank frequently in recent weeks, asking odd questions about account transfers and investment withdrawals. Harold thought he seemed agitated, almost frightened. This revelation sent a ripple of excitement through the assembled ladies. Miss Marple's fingers slowed almost to stillness, though she continued the pretence of concentration on her knitting. Frightened? Mrs. Bantry's eyes gleamed with interest. Whatever could Charles Ashworth have to be frightened of? The man was solid as a rock, financially and otherwise. Mrs. Foster glanced around the room before continuing in lowered tones. Harold said Charles kept mentioning something about making things right and protecting what matters. He even asked about procedures for changing beneficiaries on accounts. Harold assumed it was routine estate planning, but now it sounds rather ominous, Miss Weatherby finished grimly, especially considering his sudden death. Mrs. Clement set down her teacup with unnecessary force. Mark my words, there's something not right about this whole business. Charles Ashworth was healthy as a horse 6 months ago, and now he's dead of heart failure, at 58, and that wife of his showing no more emotion than a shop mannequin. The conversation was interrupted by a gentle knock at the door. Diana returned moments later with Timothy Ashworth, who had called regarding some local charity matter. The young man appeared haggard, his grief evident in every line of his face. "I do hope I'm not intruding," he said, accepting Diana's offer of tea with obvious gratitude. "I've been rather at loose ends since the funeral." Mrs. Bantry, never one to miss an opportunity for first-hand information, immediately engaged him in conversation. "You must be finding this all terribly difficult, my dear boy. Your uncle's death was such a shock to everyone." Timothy's hands trembled slightly as he lifted his teacup. "It's all so sudden, you see." Uncle Charles was robust for his age, and lately he'd been so preoccupied, so worried. He kept mentioning large sums of money, something about a venture gone wrong, and he had a terrible row with Mr. Whitman, the solicitor, just days before he died. Shouting, really. Something about papers that were missing or had been altered. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting with the expression of gentle concern. "How distressing for you all. And Mrs. Ashworth? Was she aware of these financial difficulties?" Timothy hesitated, a flicker of something, resentment perhaps, crossing his features. Aunt Helena always seemed rather detached from Uncle Charles's business affairs. She was more concerned with the house, the garden, her social engagements, but she must have known something was amiss. He paused, then added quietly, "Though she certainly doesn't seem to be grieving much now, does she?" After Timothy's departure, the ladies' speculation reached new heights. Mrs. Price voiced what several were thinking. There are ways, you know, to make things appear natural when they're not. These days, with all the modern knowledge of substances. Mrs. Foster nodded agreement. And there's poor Miss Morrison. Harold saw her at the bank yesterday, quite distraught about losing her position. Apparently, Helena dismissed her immediately, after 15 years of faithful service. As the afternoon wore on and the guests gradually departed, Miss Marple found herself with much to consider. The village had provided a wealth of information, though separating fact from speculation would require careful thought. Charles Ashworth had been worried about something significant enough to consider changing his financial arrangements. His sudden death had left a widow who displayed no grief, and a nephew who harboured growing suspicions. Walking slowly back through the village as evening approached, Miss Marple reflected on the afternoon's revelations. In her long experience, she had learned that when people departed significantly from expected patterns of behaviour, there was usually a compelling reason. The widow who refused to weep was indeed becoming a more intriguing puzzle with each passing hour, and Miss Marple suspected that before long someone in Bramley Cross would make a mistake that would illuminate the truth behind Charles Ashworth's convenient demise. The pieces were scattered, but the pattern was beginning to emerge. Soon, she thought, it would be time to look more closely at the evidence that others had overlooked. The following morning brought a crisp clarity to Bramley Cross that seemed to sharpen every detail, and Miss Marple found herself drawn to an early walk through the village. Her ostensible purpose was a condolence call, but her actual intention was to observe the daily rhythms of a community still processing the shock of sudden death. She had found, over a long life, that such visits granted one the sort of access that formal interviews rarely afforded. Ashworth House maintained an air of order so precise it bordered on the theatrical. A parlour-maid in a spotless apron admitted her to the morning room, where Helena Ashworth stood near the French windows like a figure cut from elegant marble. Miss Marple noted the immaculate arrangement of lilies on a side table, their scent assertive and faintly medicinal, though beneath it lingered something more astringent, the ghost of a scent in a room that had been cleaned too conscientiously. "My dear Mrs. Ashworth," Miss Marple said with gentle sympathy, "I thought perhaps a few flowers from my great-niece's garden might be welcome. Such a difficult time for you." "Very kind," Helena replied, accepting the modest bouquet without once lowering her gaze. "It is astonishing what kindness one encounters at times like these." She sounded almost surprised by it, as if kindness were a novelty requiring examination. Miss Marple's eyes drifted casually to a small occasional table by the window. It bore a single ring mark, darker than the rest of the gleaming wood and not entirely erased despite obvious recent polishing. The shape suggested a glass that had stood long enough to leave a firm impression. As they spoke, she noticed that the door to what must be Charles's study bore a new, bright lock, recently installed, with none of the gentle wear shown by the other doors in the house. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Pembroke, who started slightly upon seeing Miss Marple but gave a courteous bow. His medical bag seemed heavier than usual, and his manner carried the weight of professional concern. After taking her leave from Helena, Miss Marple found herself walking alongside the doctor toward the village centre. "Such a shock for everyone," she observed gently. "Mr. Ashworth's sudden passing must have been quite unexpected from a medical standpoint. Dr. Pembroke's expression grew troubled. "Indeed, most peculiar. Charles had his last examination just 6 weeks ago, showed no signs of cardiac weakness whatsoever. Quite robust for a man of his age, actually." He paused, then added almost to himself, "In my experience, such sudden changes don't occur without warning signs." "How puzzling that must be for you, Doctor," Miss Marple murmured encouragingly. He had complained of some stress-related symptoms recently, indigestion, occasional breathlessness, but nothing suggesting imminent cardiac failure. He'd been taking bromide powders for sleep at his wife's suggestion, but that's hardly unusual for a worried man. The doctor's frown deepened. "Still, I've recommended that Mrs. Ashworth consider a change of scenery. She seems remarkably composed, but grief can manifest in unexpected ways." As they parted ways, Miss Marple reflected on this significant information. A healthy man doesn't typically suffer sudden heart failure without preceding symptoms, yet Dr. Pembroke's examination had revealed none. Her contemplation was interrupted by the approach of a stocky man with frank eyes and a notebook, Inspector Lennox from the County Constabulary, who had been conducting what appeared to be a routine inquiry into Charles's death. "Inspector," Miss Marple acknowledged with a pleasant nod, "I trust your investigation is proceeding satisfactorily?" Lennox studied her with wary interest. "Well enough, Miss Marple. Though I find myself with more theories than facts at present. The bank manager mentions financial concerns, the solicitor seems nervous, though that could be his natural manner, and there's considerable talk about the widow's composure." "Widows are often misunderstood," Miss Marple observed mildly. "Sometimes they are quite as they appear. Sometimes they are very different indeed." "I shall bear that in mind," Lennox replied with a slight smile, though the medical evidence seemed straightforward enough. "Natural causes, according to Dr. Pembroke." Miss Marple continued her walk, noting that the inspector's approach, while thorough, seemed to accept the surface explanation without delving into the subtler currents beneath. Her next encounter proved far more illuminating. She found Miss Morrison emerging from the post office with red-rimmed eyes and a cardboard box clutched tightly in her arms. The former secretary looked startled when she saw Miss Marple and nearly dropped her burden. "Oh, Miss Marple, good morning," she stammered. "I was just collecting my personal items." Mrs. Ashworth felt it would be best if I gathered everything promptly. Miss Marple's expression conveyed gentle sympathy. "How difficult this must be for you, my dear. 15 years is a considerable time to spend in service to one family." Miss Morrison's composure cracked. "Mr. Ashworth was always so appreciative of my work. He said just last week that he didn't know how he'd manage without me, and now Mrs. Ashworth has made it quite clear that my services are no longer required." Her voice trembled with a mixture of grief and indignation. "Perhaps she feels the painful associations would be too difficult," Miss Marple suggested diplomatically, though she was studying Miss Morrison's face with keen interest. "Perhaps," Miss Morrison replied doubtfully, "though it does seem odd that she would dismiss someone who knew Mr. Ashworth's business affairs so intimately. There are so many ongoing matters requiring attention." She glanced around nervously before continuing in lowered tones. "Mr. Ashworth had been terribly worried about something in recent weeks. He kept checking and rechecking certain files, making copies of documents, asking me the most peculiar questions about dates and signatures." Miss Marple's knitting needles, which she had withdrawn during their conversation, maintained their steady rhythm while her mind recorded every detail. "How troubling for him, and for you to witness his distress. The strangest thing was that he asked me to witness his signature on some legal documents just 3 days before he died. He seemed almost furtive about it, as if he didn't want anyone else to know. And he kept a locked ledger that he was very particular about, wouldn't let anyone else handle it." Miss Morrison shifted the box in her arms. "Mrs. Ashworth had the entire study cleared yesterday. Everything gone, the ledger, his private correspondence, all of it. She said it was too painful to have his things around, but she wouldn't even let me retrieve my own effects from my desk, just handed me this box at the door." "And the argument with Mr. Whitman?" Miss Marple inquired gently. Miss Morrison nodded emphatically. "Dreadful shouting, something about missing papers and altered documents. Mr. Ashworth was furious. I'd never seen him like that. He dictated a letter to Mr. Whitman afterward, insisted I make an extra copy for the files, but when I went to file it the next day, the carbon copy had disappeared." After Miss Morrison departed, Miss Marple made her way to the church, where she encountered Reverend Matthews arranging flowers. Their conversation revealed another piece of the puzzle. Charles had sought spiritual counsel twice in recent weeks, speaking of sins of omission and wondering whether it was ever too late to make amends for past mistakes. As the day progressed, Miss Marple positioned herself strategically around the village, observing the interactions between the key players. She watched Helena receiving visitors with her characteristic composure, noted Mr. Whitman's increasingly harried appearance, and observed Timothy's growing agitation as he questioned the solicitor about missing assets and delayed accountings. By evening, as she sat in Diana's garden with her knitting, Miss Marple had assembled a troubling picture. Charles Ashworth had been a healthy man who suddenly became anxious about financial matters and legal documents. He had sought to make changes to his affairs, possibly to correct past mistakes or protect certain interests. His death had prevented these changes from being implemented, and his widow had moved with remarkable speed to eliminate any evidence of his recent concerns. The official investigation, she observed, was proceeding along predictably routine lines, accepting the medical diagnosis and the widow's cooperation at face value. But Miss Marple's experienced eye saw patterns that suggested a far more complex truth lay beneath the surface of apparent normalcy. She thought of the ring mark on Helena's table, the new lock on the study door, and the hastily destroyed papers. Like a gardener who notices when a plant has been recently disturbed, she recognized the signs of someone working quickly to rearrange the evidence of recent events. Tomorrow, she decided, it would be time to dig a little deeper into the carefully tended garden of Bramley Cross's secrets. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern, though the complete picture remained tantalizingly out of reach. But Miss Marple had learned patience over many years of observation, and she knew that those who moved too quickly to cover their tracks often left the most revealing clues behind. The third morning after Charles Ashworth's funeral, brought a development that seemed to satisfy everyone's need for resolution, though it left Miss Marple feeling distinctly unsettled. Inspector Lennox arrived at Rosemary Cottage with the purposeful air of a man who had found his answer, his notebook thick with what appeared to be damning evidence. "I thought you might be interested to know, Miss Marple," he began, settling into Diana's best chair with evident satisfaction, "that our investigation has taken a decisive turn. Young Timothy Ashworth has become our primary suspect in his uncle's death." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused in their gentle rhythm. "Indeed? How very distressing for the young man." "The evidence is quite compelling," Lennox continued, consulting his notes. "Timothy had substantial debts, gambling, expensive tastes, that motor car he could never afford on his clerk's salary. He was entirely dependent on his uncle's generosity, and there are witnesses to several heated arguments between them in recent weeks. Mrs. Price at the bakery heard Timothy shouting something about making Uncle Charles pay just days before the death. The inspector's confidence was evident, and Miss Marple could understand why. Timothy presented the perfect suspect, young, impulsive, financially desperate, and with clear motive and opportunity. The village had already begun to accept this explanation, with the relief that comes when a disturbing mystery finds a comprehensible solution. "And his whereabouts on the evening of his uncle's death?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "Claims he was working late in his studio, alone. No witnesses, naturally. And here's the interesting part. Doctor. Pembroke has revised his initial assessment. Upon closer examination, he's found traces suggesting that Charles's heart failure may have been induced by an overdose of his regular bromide powders, possibly combined with alcohol. Timothy had access to the house, knew his uncle's habits, and would have found it simple enough to tamper with the medication." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, though something in her expression suggested reservation rather than conviction. She had observed Timothy closely at the funeral and during his visit to Diana's cottage, and his grief had struck her as entirely genuine. The young man's transparent nature, his obvious emotional distress, and his clumsy attempts to understand his uncle's recent behaviour all spoke of someone overwhelmed by circumstances rather than someone capable of calculated murder. Her contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Whitman, the family solicitor, who appeared at the garden gate looking more agitated than ever. His usual nervous demeanour had intensified to something approaching panic, and his hands trembled as he clutched a leather portfolio. "Inspector Lennox," he called breathlessly, "I must speak with you urgently." There are aspects of this case that haven't been properly considered. Lennox received him with the patience of a man confident in his conclusions, but Whitman's next words commanded immediate attention. Charles Ashworth had been conducting his own investigation into what he believed were serious financial irregularities in his accounts. He suspected someone close to him had been systematically defrauding him over a period of years, forging signatures, altering documents, manipulating investments. He was planning to confront the perpetrator, but wanted irrefutable proof first. This revelation cast the entire investigation in a different light. Miss Marple's needles resumed their clicking, but her attention was entirely focused on Whitman's increasingly urgent explanation. "Charles specifically asked me not to mention his suspicions to Mrs. Ashworth until he could gather sufficient evidence. He was devastated by the possibility that someone he trusted implicitly had been betraying him. The missing papers, the altered documents he complained about, they weren't paranoid delusions, Inspector. They were real, and they pointed to a pattern of sophisticated financial manipulation." Lennox frowned, clearly reluctant to abandon his neat solution. "Even if that's true, Mr. Whitman, it doesn't eliminate Timothy as a suspect. Financial desperation could have driven him to both fraud and murder." "But Timothy lacks the sophistication for such elaborate deception," Whitman protested. "The alterations Charles discovered required intimate knowledge of his banking habits, his signature patterns, his investment preferences. They showed planning that went back years, not the desperate improvisation of a young man in immediate financial trouble." Miss Marple observed this exchange with growing interest, particularly noting how the solicitor's revelations aligned with her own observations of Helena Ashworth's behaviour. The widow's swift clearing of Charles's study, her dismissal of Miss Morrison, and her remarkable composure all suggested someone with something significant to hide. As if summoned by their discussion, Helena herself appeared at the garden gate, her approach as composed and graceful as ever. Her greeting to the assembled group was cordial, though Miss Marple detected a subtle tension in her manner when she addressed Whitman. "I trust the investigation is proceeding satisfactorily, Inspector," Helena said, with calm authority. "This uncertainty is distressing for everyone in the village." "We're making excellent progress, Mrs. Ashworth," Lennox replied, "though Mr. Whitman has raised some questions about your late husband's recent concerns." Helena's expression didn't change, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of something, calculation perhaps, in her eyes. "Charles had been under considerable stress lately, Inspector. Stress can lead to unfounded suspicions, paranoid thoughts about perfectly ordinary business matters. I'm sure, Mr. Whitman understands how worry can distort one's perceptions." The solicitor's face reddened. "Mrs. Ashworth, with respect, Charles's concerns were based on concrete evidence. He showed me discrepancies in account statements, signatures that didn't match previous examples, investment decisions he couldn't remember authorizing." "Memory can be unreliable when one is under strain," Helena replied smoothly, "and Charles had been drinking more heavily than usual. I'm afraid his judgment wasn't entirely sound in those final weeks." Miss Marple watched this exchange with the careful attention she might pay to a complex knitting pattern, noting how Helena deflected each of Whitman's points with explanations that were plausible, but somehow too convenient. The widow's ability to remain composed under questioning was remarkable, or perhaps revealing. After Helena departed and Lennox returned to his investigation, Miss Marple found herself alone with her thoughts. The case against Timothy was circumstantially strong, but it relied on accepting him as capable of both sophisticated financial fraud and cold-blooded murder. Her long experience with human nature suggested that such combinations were rare, particularly in someone of Timothy's transparent and emotional character. The real question, she reflected, was not who had the obvious motive, but who had the subtle opportunity and the necessary knowledge to execute such an elaborate deception. As she watched Helena Ashworth's composed figure disappear around the corner, Miss Marple began to suspect that the obvious culprit was serving as a very convenient distraction from the real perpetrator's careful handiwork. The investigation might be focusing on Timothy Ashworth, but Miss Marple's attention was increasingly drawn to the widow who had shown such remarkable efficiency in tidying away the evidence of her husband's final troubling discoveries. That evening, as Miss Marple sat in Diana's garden reviewing the day's revelations, she found herself increasingly troubled by the neat efficiency with which all evidence of Charles Ashworth's final concerns had been eliminated. The official investigation might be satisfied with Timothy as their suspect, but her own instincts suggested that someone with far more sophisticated knowledge had orchestrated both the crime and its aftermath. The following morning brought an opportunity to test her growing suspicions. Helena Ashworth had mentioned during their previous encounter that she would be visiting her sister in the neighbouring village, leaving Miss Marple free to conduct a more thorough examination of the physical evidence that others had overlooked. She began with another condolence call to Ashworth House, this time bearing a small arrangement of late roses, and the perfectly reasonable excuse of checking whether Helena might need any assistance with household matters. The parlour-maid, Lena, received her with the harried expression of someone managing an understaffed household since Miss Morrison's abrupt dismissal. "Mrs. Ashworth has gone to see her sister," Lena explained, "but she said any callers should be made comfortable. Shall I put your flowers in water, miss?" Miss Marple accepted this offer graciously, following Lena toward the morning room, while maintaining the gentle conversation that encouraged confidences. As they passed the corridor leading to Charles's study, her attention was immediately drawn to the new brass lock that secured the door. Something glinted there, a tiny fragment caught in the mechanism's bright metal surface. Pausing to adjust her glove, Miss Marple bent slightly and observed the detail more closely. It was a thread, barely visible but distinctly present. Not cotton or wool, but silk of a particular shade. The colour was neither black nor white, but a subtle grey that would be nearly invisible against most fabrics. More significantly, it appeared to have been caught recently, trapped when the lock was engaged by someone whose clothing had snagged on the sharp metal edge. "Such a beautiful new lock," Miss Marple observed to Lena. "Mrs. Ashworth must have felt it necessary for security." "Oh, yes, miss," Lena replied readily. "Had it fitted the very day after the master died. Said she couldn't bear the thought of anyone disturbing his private things, though she spent considerable time in there herself that first day, sorting through papers and such." Miss Marple filed this information carefully while continuing to study the thread. Its quality and colour suggested expensive fabric, the sort used in fine garments where visible stitching would be considered vulgar. She had seen such thread before, employed by skilled seamstresses who understood that true elegance lay in invisible craftsmanship. After completing her visit to Ashworth House, Miss Marple made her way to the village with the methodical purpose of someone following a carefully planned route. Her first stop was Mrs. Briggs at the wash-house, where she inquired about collecting some mending for Diana. "Certainly, Miss Marple," Mrs. Briggs said, producing a neatly wrapped bundle. "Though I must say, your great-niece's needlework is far superior to some I could mention. There's ladies in this village who insist on the most particular requirements. Grey silk thread for black garments, if you can imagine such fussiness." Miss Marple's needles clicked with sudden interest. "Grey silk? How very unusual. I should have thought black thread would be more appropriate for mourning clothes." "You'd think so, wouldn't you?" Mrs. Briggs leaned closer conspiratorially. "But there's one lady, no names mind you, who won't have a black stitch showing on her black dresses. Says it looks common. Had me mend a torn sleeve just yesterday, caught on something sharp by the look of it. Use the grey silk, she says, so the repair won't show in daylight." The seamstress's revelation confirmed Miss Marple's growing suspicions. A torn sleeve, mended with grey silk thread, and a fragment of identical thread caught in a newly installed lock painted a compelling picture of someone who had been in considerable haste to secure Charles's study. Her next destination was Mr. Hales's drapery, where she purchased needles and casually inquired about thread selection. The shopkeeper proved equally informative. "Grey silk is rarely requested," he explained, examining a sample spool. "Very particular shade. Gunmetal, we call it. Only one customer in Bramley Cross orders this exact colour regularly. Mrs. Ashworth has very exacting standards for her sewing." Armed with this confirmation, Miss Marple completed her circuit at the chemist's shop, where Mr. Larkin's well-meaning chattiness provided the final piece of her emerging puzzle. "Dreadful business about Mr. Ashworth," he confided while preparing Diana's order. "Though, I must say, Mrs. Ashworth's request last week struck me as rather thoughtful. She asked whether I might prepare her husband's bromide powders with a less bitter base. Said he'd been complaining about the chalky taste. Of course, I was careful not to alter the dosage significantly, but a small adjustment to make the medicine more palatable seemed reasonable." Miss Marple accepted this information with the same calm attention she paid to all village confidences, though inwardly she noted its sinister implications. A wife with access to her husband's medication, requesting modifications that would mask any additional substances, presented troubling possibilities indeed. As she walked slowly home through the village centre, Miss Marple reflected on the morning's discoveries. The grey silk thread provided physical evidence linking Helena directly to the hasty securing of Charles's study. The torn sleeve, mended immediately after his death, suggested someone who had been working urgently with sharp metal objects, perhaps new locks, perhaps other hardware. The modified bromide powders offered a perfect vehicle for introducing additional substances that might induce the cardiac failure doctor. Pembroke had diagnosed. Most tellingly, the timeline revealed a woman who had moved with remarkable efficiency to control access to her husband's private papers, while simultaneously eliminating the one person, Miss Morrison, who possessed intimate knowledge of his recent concerns about financial irregularities. Miss Marple paused at the churchyard gate, observing the Ashworth plot where fresh flowers maintained their vigil over the recent grave. The elaborate displays spoke of a community's respect for the deceased, but she found herself wondering what Charles Ashworth might have discovered in those final weeks that had made his continued existence inconvenient for someone he trusted implicitly. The thread caught in the lock was a small thing, easily overlooked by those who saw only the obvious surface of events. But Miss Marple had learned over many years that the most revealing evidence often lay in such tiny details. the imperfect stitch in an otherwise flawless pattern, the single thread that didn't belong, the small mistake that exposed a larger deception. Helena Ashworth's performance as the composed widow was nearly perfect, but like all human endeavours, it contained small flaws that betrayed the careful planning beneath. Tomorrow, Miss Marple decided, it would be time to delve deeper into the buried secrets that had made Charles Ashworth's death not just convenient, but necessary. The grey silk thread represented more than mere physical evidence. It was proof that someone had been in considerable haste to secure something valuable, and that their urgency had led to the kind of small telling mistake that would eventually unravel their entire carefully constructed deception. The discovery of the grey silk thread had provided Miss Marple with her first tangible evidence, but she understood that the deeper truths of Charles Ashworth's death lay buried beneath years of carefully maintained facades and unspoken family grievances. The following morning, she embarked on a more systematic exploration of the relationships that had shaped the Ashworth household, beginning with those who had observed Helena's character most closely over the years. Her first call was upon Mrs. Violet Ashworth, whose sharp disapproval of her sister-in-law had been evident even at the funeral. Miss Marple found Violet in her precisely ordered drawing-room, surrounded by photographs that spoke of a life dedicated to propriety and family duty. "I'm glad you've come, Miss Marple," Violet began, without preamble, her voice carrying the weight of long-suppressed grievances. "Perhaps it's time someone understood the truth about Helena and her marriage to my brother-in-law." Charles was a generous man, too generous for his own good, and Helena exploited that generosity from the very beginning. Miss Marple's needles maintained their gentle rhythm as she encouraged these revelations with sympathetic murmurs. Violet's account painted a picture of a marriage, built on calculation rather than affection, where Helena had systematically isolated Charles from his family while establishing herself as the sole beneficiary of his devotion. Charles had always been protective of Timothy's inheritance, Violet continued, her hands twisting in her lap. He established a substantial trust fund for the boy after his father died. But in recent years, Helena convinced him to reduce Timothy's monthly allowance, claiming the investments were performing poorly. I suspected then that she was diverting funds for her own purposes, the new conservatory, expensive clothing, that motor car she insisted upon. This revelation provided crucial context for Timothy's financial difficulties and suggested a pattern of manipulation that extended far beyond simple marital influence. Miss Marple filed away this information while gently probing for additional details about Helena's character and behaviour. Her next visit was to Miss Morrison, whom she found in her modest lodgings, still visibly distressed by her abrupt dismissal. The former secretary's testimony proved even more illuminating, particularly regarding Charles's recent behaviour and the mysterious red ledger that had consumed his attention in his final weeks. Mr. Ashworth kept meticulous financial records, Miss Morrison explained, her voice trembling with emotion. He had a private red ledger where he documented all his personal investments and transactions. In recent months, he became increasingly secretive about it, locking it away and consulting it only when he was alone. He seemed to be comparing current statements with older documents, making notes, asking me peculiar questions about dates and signatures. The significance of this ledger became clearer as Miss Morrison described how Helena had removed it from the study immediately after Charles's death, claiming it contained personal notes too painful to preserve. The swift elimination of this evidence suggested someone who understood exactly what damaging information it might contain. Miss Marple's conversation with Mr. Whitman provided the legal framework that made sense of these revelations. The solicitor, clearly under considerable stress, revealed that Charles had been preparing a comprehensive case against someone he suspected of systematic embezzlement, including forged signatures and unauthorized transactions spanning several years. He was particularly concerned about certain insurance policies, Whitman confided, glancing nervously around his office. Policies on his life that he claimed never to have authorized with Mrs. Ashworth as the sole beneficiary. He asked me to investigate their validity and was planning to contest them legally. He also mentioned his intention to revise his will significantly, specifically to protect Timothy's inheritance from what he called unscrupulous interference. The pattern emerging from these testimonies was damning in its consistency. Helena had not, simply been an opportunistic wife. She had been conducting a long-term campaign to systematically transfer Charles's wealth, while preparing for the day when his continued existence would become inconvenient. The prenuptial agreement that should have protected Timothy's inheritance had apparently been circumvented through a combination of manipulation and fraud. Miss Marple's investigation was interrupted by an unexpected encounter with Helena herself, who appeared at Whitman's office with her characteristic composed grace. The widow's timing seemed almost supernatural, as if she possessed an instinct for moments when her affairs were being discussed. "I do hope I'm not interrupting anything important," Helena said, with perfect social ease, though Miss Marple detected a subtle tension in her posture as she assessed the assembled group. The conversation that followed revealed Helena's sophisticated understanding of how to deflect suspicion while simultaneously threatening those who might pose a danger to her carefully constructed narrative. When Whitman mentioned Charles's recent concerns about financial irregularities, Helena smoothly dismissed them as the paranoid delusions of a man under stress. Charles had been drinking more heavily than usual in recent weeks, she explained with apparent concern. The strain of his business affairs was affecting his judgment. I'm afraid he began seeing conspiracies where none existed, questioning perfectly legitimate transactions and arrangements. Miss Marple observed this performance with growing fascination, noting how Helena managed to appear both sympathetic and authoritative, while systematically undermining the credibility of anyone who might challenge her version of events. The widow's ability to remain composed under questioning was remarkable, but it also revealed the calculating intelligence of someone who had been preparing for such scrutiny. As the afternoon progressed and the various testimonies accumulated, Miss Marple began to see the complete scope of Helena's deception. This was not a crime of passion or desperation, but the culmination of a carefully orchestrated campaign that had been years in the making. The grey silk thread, the hastily secured study, the dismissed secretary, and the destroyed evidence all represented the final phase of a plan that had required both patience and ruthlessness to execute. The widow who refused to weep was indeed hiding something far more sinister than simple lack of grief. She was concealing the methodical elimination of a husband who had finally discovered her betrayal and was preparing to expose her crimes. Tomorrow, Miss Marple reflected, it would be time to observe how Helena responded when the pressure of investigation began to threaten her carefully maintained composure. The revelations about Helena's systematic deception had barely settled in Miss Marple's mind when the morning of the 5th day brought news that confirmed her darkest suspicions. She was arranging flowers in Diana's sitting room when Mrs. Clement arrived breathless at the door, her face pale with shock and terrible excitement. "Miss Marple, you must come at once," she gasped, clutching the doorframe for support. "Miss Morrison has been found dead in her lodgings. The poor woman, her landlady discovered her this morning when she failed to appear for breakfast." Miss Marple set down her secateurs with deliberate calm, though her mind immediately began calculating the sinister implications. Miss Morrison's death, coming so soon after her dismissal and her revelations about Charles's private concerns, seemed far too convenient to be coincidental. Dr. Pembroke was emerging from the modest lodging-house as Miss Marple arrived, his medical bag in hand and his expression grave with professional concern. "Another sudden cardiac failure," he informed Inspector Lennox, who had arrived with unusual promptness. Though Miss Morrison was considerably younger than Mr. Ashworth, and had shown no previous signs of heart weakness during her recent examinations. The scene inside Miss Morrison's rooms painted a picture of someone who had been living in considerable distress since her abrupt dismissal. Her few possessions were scattered about as if she had been searching frantically for something, and her small writing desk bore evidence of recent correspondence. Several letters begun but not completed, their contents suggesting mounting desperation about her financial situation. Miss Marple's attention was immediately drawn to an empty medicine bottle on the bedside table. The label, written in the careful script of Mr. Larkin the chemist, indicated bromide powders for sleep, the same medication Charles had been taking in his final weeks. "She complained of terrible insomnia since losing her position," the landlady explained tearfully to Inspector Lennox. "Said she couldn't stop worrying about Mr. Ashworth's death and what would become of her without employment. Yesterday evening, a lady called with medicine to help her sleep," said Dr. Pembroke had recommended it. Dr. Pembroke looked up sharply from his examination. "I prescribed no such medication for Miss Morrison. In fact, I specifically advised against self-medicating when she consulted me about her anxiety. Miss Marple observed this exchange with growing certainty about what had transpired. The pattern was becoming disturbingly clear. Someone was using the same method that had eliminated Charles to silence the one person who possessed detailed knowledge of his recent discoveries. Her suspicions were confirmed when she discovered a partially completed letter hidden beneath Miss Morrison's blotting paper. The secretary's desperate final attempt at communication revealed the full extent of what she had witnessed. I can no longer remain silent about the irregularities I observed in Mr. Ashworth's accounts. The red ledger contained evidence of systematic manipulation spanning several years. Signatures had been forged, investments redirected, and substantial sums transferred to accounts I did not recognize. Mr. Ashworth had discovered discrepancies totaling nearly £15,000, and he was preparing legal action when he died so suddenly. I fear that my knowledge of these matters has placed me in considerable danger, as Mrs. Ashworth has made it clear that my continued presence in the village is unwelcome. The letter ended abruptly mid-sentence, the pen trailing off as if Miss Morrison had been interrupted while writing. The implications were chilling. Helena had realized that the secretary posed an ongoing threat to her carefully constructed innocence, and had acted with the same ruthless efficiency that had eliminated her husband. Inspector Lennox's investigation revealed additional disturbing details. The medicine had been delivered the previous evening by a woman matching Helena's description, who had claimed to be acting on Dr. Pembroke's recommendation. When questioned, several neighbours recalled seeing a well-dressed lady in a dark coat leaving Miss Morrison's building around 9 o'clock, approximately the time the fatal dose would have been administered. Miss Marple noted with particular interest how Helena received news of Miss Morrison's death. The widow's response was perfectly calibrated, appropriate concern mixed with gentle regret, expressing sympathy for the secretary's distressed state while carefully avoiding any admission of recent contact. "Poor Miss Morrison was so distraught since Charles's passing," Helena murmured to Inspector Lennox with composed sympathy. "I did suggest she might benefit from something to help her sleep, but I certainly didn't expect such a tragic outcome. One assumes these medications are safe when properly administered." This carefully worded statement revealed Helena's sophisticated understanding of how to acknowledge her involvement while maintaining plausible deniability. She had indeed provided the fatal medication, but framed her actions as humanitarian concern rather than calculated murder. The second death fundamentally altered the investigation's dynamics. Timothy's potential arrest, which had seemed imminent, was indefinitely postponed as Lennox grappled with the implications of Miss Morrison's demise. The young man's alibi for the previous evening was unshakable. He had been dining with friends in the neighbouring village, with multiple witnesses to confirm his presence. More significantly, Miss Morrison's unfinished letter provided direct evidence of the financial crimes Charles had discovered, and clear motive for both deaths. The secretary's elimination had been necessary to prevent her testimony from exposing Helena's years of systematic theft and forgery. As Miss Marple walked slowly home through the village, she reflected on how the second death had revealed the true scope of Helena's desperation. The widow, who refused to weep, was not merely concealing grief. She was protecting a carefully constructed criminal enterprise that had required her husband's death to preserve. Tomorrow, Miss Marple decided, it would be time to apply more direct pressure to see how Helena's perfect composure held up under deliberate scrutiny. The killer had made her fatal error in believing that silence could be purchased with another death. Instead, she had confirmed the pattern of her guilt and provided Miss Marple with the final pieces needed to expose the truth behind Bramley Cross's tragic deception. Miss Morrison's death had confirmed Miss Marple's darkest suspicions, but she understood that exposing Helena's guilt would require more than circumstantial evidence. The widow's performance had been so carefully calibrated that direct confrontation would yield only denials. What was needed was a situation where Helena's true nature would reveal itself through unguarded reactions to carefully placed psychological pressure. With this purpose in mind, Miss Marple approached Diana the following morning with a proposal that seemed entirely innocent, but was designed with the precision of a well-laid snare. "My dear," she said over breakfast, "I've been thinking we should host a small gathering. Nothing elaborate, just tea in the garden for a few local friends. It might provide comfort to those still troubled by recent events, and I confess I should like to become better acquainted with Mrs. Ashworth before I return home." Diana readily agreed, and by afternoon carefully selected invitations had been extended. Helena accepted with gracious composure, as did Dr. Pembroke, Mr. Whitman, Mrs. Violet Ashworth and Timothy. Miss Marple had positioned the garden chairs to ensure Helena would be clearly visible to all present, while she herself remained where she could observe every nuance of expression. The gathering convened on a crisp afternoon, autumn flowers providing a deceptively peaceful backdrop. Miss Marple had arranged her sewing basket nearby, with spools of thread artfully displayed, including one of that distinctive grey silk. On a side table lay a red, leather-bound volume, positioned to catch the eye of anyone familiar with Charles Ashworth's missing ledger. Helena arrived impeccably dressed, her composure flawless, though Miss Marple detected a faint tightness around her eyes. The conversation began conventionally, but Miss Marple gradually steered it toward the recent tragedies. "Such remarkable coincidences," she mused gently, her knitting needles clicking. "Two sudden cardiac failures in such a small community. Both dear Charles and Miss Morrison had been taking bromide for sleep difficulties, hadn't they?" Helena's response was perfectly measured. "Dr. Pembroke assures me such coincidences, while distressing, do occur. Both had been under considerable stress." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, then introduced her first deliberate provocation. "I understand, Mr. Ashworth had been quite worried about financial matters. How efficiently you resolved those concerns after his passing." For the first time, Helena's composure flickered almost imperceptibly. Her teacup trembled slightly before she recovered. "Charles's affairs were complex, but I ensured his wishes were carried out properly." "Mr. Whitman mentioned irregularities in his accounts," Miss Marple continued innocently. "I trust those matters were satisfactorily resolved." The solicitor shifted uncomfortably, glancing nervously at Helena. "Certain documentation Mr. Ashworth wished to examine has proven difficult to locate." Helena's voice carried a subtle edge. Charles was sometimes careless with papers, particularly when his judgment was affected by stress and alcohol. Some documents may have been mislaid. Miss Marple's needles paused as she reached for the grey silk thread. How distressing for Miss Morrison, given her intimate knowledge of his filing systems. Such a pity about that red ledger she mentioned, the one where he kept his private transaction records. At the mention of the ledger, Helena's gaze flickered involuntarily toward the red book on the side table. Her hands clenched briefly in her lap before she composed herself. "The ledger contained nothing important," Helena said smoothly, though her voice had lost some warmth. "Merely personal notes. I removed it to spare painful memories." Miss Marple lifted the grey silk thread, examining it in the afternoon light. "This shade is so useful for invisible repairs," she observed conversationally. "A dear friend once mentioned how grey silk disappears on dark fabrics, unless caught on something sharp like new brass fittings. Then it becomes quite noticeable." Helena's eyes fixed on the thread with unmistakable recognition. A tiny muscle twitched at her temple. "Miss Morrison seemed quite distressed about missing documents," Miss Marple continued gently. "She mentioned witnessing Mr. Ashworth's signature on papers just before his death, papers that subsequently vanished." Mrs. Violet Ashworth leaned forward. "Those documents concerned Charles's intention to revise his will, protecting Timothy's inheritance from undue influence." The atmosphere grew taut. Helena's perfect mask slipped fractionally, revealing something cold beneath. "Charles's will is a private matter, and his intentions were always clear." "Indeed," Miss Marple mused, still examining the grey thread, "though it is curious how certain evidence disappears after sudden deaths, like threads that come loose from otherwise perfectly woven fabric." Helena's composure finally cracked visibly. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and her carefully controlled eyes flashed with something approaching panic. The psychological pressure had achieved its purpose. For the first time, the widow who refused to weep had shown genuine emotion, and that emotion was fear. As the gathering dispersed, Miss Marple watched Helena's departure with quiet satisfaction. The subtle test had revealed what direct questioning never could. Beneath the perfect facade lay a calculating mind that recognized its own handiwork when confronted with it. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation, but today had provided the confirmation she needed. The grey silk thread lay coiled in her palm, evidence both literal and metaphorical of how the most carefully constructed deceptions could unravel through the smallest overlooked details. The morning following Miss Marple's garden party dawned clear and decisive. Helena's visible reaction to the grey silk thread had provided the final confirmation needed, and Miss Marple requested that Inspector Lennox arrange one last gathering at Ashworth House. The assembled company, Helena herself, Dr. Pembroke, Mr. Whitman, Timothy, and Mrs. Violet Ashworth, created a tableau of barely contained tension in the morning room where this tragedy had begun. Miss Marple positioned herself near the window, her knitting resting in her lap, and began with the gentle authority that had served her so well over the years. We gather today because 2 deaths in our peaceful village demand explanation. Both Mr. Ashworth and Miss Morrison died of apparent cardiac failure, yet the circumstances surrounding these deaths reveal a pattern that cannot be attributed to mere coincidence. Helena maintained her characteristic composure, though Miss Marple observed the subtle tightness around her eyes. Miss Marple, while I appreciate your concern, surely the medical evidence speaks clearly enough. Indeed, it does, Miss Marple agreed pleasantly, but not in the way you might hope. Dr. Pembroke, you expressed surprise at Mr. Ashworth's sudden decline, given his recent robust health. The doctor nodded gravely. Most unusual. Charles showed no warning signs during his last examination. Miss Marple's needles resumed their gentle clicking. Mr. Ashworth had discovered systematic financial irregularities in his accounts, forged signatures, unauthorized transactions, missing funds. Mr. Whitman, you confirmed he was preparing legal action against someone he trusted implicitly. The solicitor shifted uncomfortably. Charles had documented evidence spanning several years. Someone with intimate knowledge of his banking habits had been systematically defrauding him. The perpetrator required several advantages, Miss Marple continued methodically. Complete access to Charles's private papers, detailed knowledge of his daily routines, the trust necessary to administer medication without suspicion, and the authority to control evidence after his death. Helena's hands tightened almost imperceptibly. These are serious accusations requiring substantial proof. Miss Marple produced the grey silk thread with careful precision. This thread was caught in the lock you had installed on Charles's study the day after his death. It matches exactly the silk Mrs. Briggs used to mend your torn sleeve, a sleeve damaged in your haste to secure his private papers and destroy the red ledger documenting your crimes. The silence grew oppressive. Timothy stared at his aunt with dawning horror. Charles died after consuming bromide powders you had specifically requested be modified to mask their bitter taste, Miss Marple continued relentlessly. Mr. Larkin confirmed your request, ostensibly to make the medication more palatable, but actually to conceal additional substances that would induce cardiac failure. Helena's mask began to slip fractionally. Pure speculation without proof. Miss Morrison's death confirmed the pattern, Miss Marple replied firmly. She possessed detailed knowledge of Charles's financial records and had witnessed his final attempts to document evidence against you. Her unfinished letter reveals she understood the danger she faced, but your visit with fatal medication silenced her permanently. Inspector Lennox stepped forward grimly. Several neighbours identified you leaving Miss Morrison's lodgings at the crucial time, Mrs. Ashworth. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle but implacable. The method was identical. Bromide powders enhanced with substances readily available from your garden, administered by someone the victims trusted completely. Charles received his fatal dose in his evening medication, Miss Morrison in the sleeping draught you provided under false medical pretense. Helena's perfect composure finally shattered. Her face contorted with rage and desperation as she realized the trap had closed completely around her. Charles was a fool, she snarled, abandoning her careful mask entirely. 25 years married to a man who valued his precious nephew more than his wife. He deserved everything I took from him. The money should have been mine by right. I earned it through years of pretending to love a tedious, suspicious old man. The confession hung in the air like a physical presence. Inspector Lennox moved toward his handcuffs. "And Miss Morrison?" Miss Marple asked quietly. "She knew too much," Helena replied with chilling matter-of-factness. "She would have destroyed everything I'd worked for." Sometimes elimination is the only practical solution. As Inspector Lennox placed Helena Ashworth under arrest, Miss Marple reflected on the tragic waste. 2 lives destroyed by greed disguised as matrimonial devotion, and a community's trust shattered by the revelation that evil could wear such a perfectly composed mask. The widow who refused to weep had finally revealed the truth behind her tearless composure. She had been incapable of mourning a man whose death she had orchestrated with such calculated precision. Timothy sat in stunned silence while Dr. Pembroke stared at the small loop of silk thread, evidence that the smallest details often reveal the largest truths. As Helena was led away, her head held high in a final desperate attempt at dignity, Miss Marple gathered her knitting with quiet satisfaction. Justice, like a well-worked pattern, had finally revealed its complete design. The hours following Helena Ashworth's arrest brought a peculiar stillness to Bramley Cross, as if the village itself needed time to absorb the magnitude of what had been revealed. In the morning room of Ashworth House, those who had witnessed Helena's confession sat in stunned contemplation, each processing the implications in their own way. Timothy Ashworth remained slumped in his chair, his face pale with the dawning comprehension of how close he had come to bearing the guilt for his aunt's crimes. The young man who had entered that room under suspicion of murder now faced the terrible knowledge that someone he had trusted and loved had orchestrated not only his uncle's death, but his own potential destruction. Mrs. Violet Ashworth was the first to break the oppressive silence. "My poor Charles," she whispered, her rigid composure finally cracking. He knew something was terribly wrong. Those final weeks he seemed so frightened, so desperate to make things right. Her eyes met Miss Marple's with a mixture of gratitude and profound sadness. Dr. Pembroke still held the grey silk thread that had provided such damning evidence, turning it over in his fingers as if it might reveal additional secrets. "To think I pronounced both deaths natural," he said quietly. "The medical profession prides itself on diagnostic accuracy, yet the most crucial diagnosis was made through observation of human nature, not scientific examination." Inspector Lennox, who had remained to oversee the securing of evidence, found himself both humbled and impressed by the morning's revelations. His neat case against Timothy had crumbled, replaced by something far more complex and sinister. "Without Miss Marple's insights," he admitted, "we might never have seen beyond the surface of apparent natural deaths to the calculated murders beneath." As news of Helena's arrest spread through the village, the carefully maintained image of the composed widow shattered completely. Mrs. Clement at the post office found herself vindicated in her earlier suspicions, though she took no pleasure in being proven right about such a terrible matter. "I always said there was something unnatural about a wife who wouldn't weep," she told her customers, though her voice carried more sorrow than triumph. The practical aftermath of Helena's crimes proved as complex as the emotional impact. Mr. Whitman, freed from the terrible pressure of trying to execute what he now realized were fraudulent instructions, threw himself into the task of unraveling years of financial manipulation. The red ledger, recovered from Helena's private safe along with forged documents and detailed records, revealed the full scope of her systematic theft. Nearly £20,000, stolen over 7 years through manipulated investments and redirected funds. Dr. Pembroke faced the professional challenge of understanding how Helena's method had so effectively mimicked natural death. His investigation, guided by Helena's confession, revealed the sophisticated use of digitalis extracted from foxglove plants in her own garden, combined with the modified bromide powders to create what appeared to be spontaneous cardiac failure. Timothy's vindication brought relief, but also the heavy responsibility of reclaiming his rightful inheritance and restoring his uncle's reputation. The young man who had been careless with money now approached financial matters with newfound seriousness, working closely with Whitman to ensure proper management of the recovered funds. The village's social fabric required careful mending. Those who had defended Helena's composure as dignified restraint struggled with feelings of betrayal, while others who had suspected something amiss found no satisfaction in being proven correct. Reverend Matthews addressed these concerns in his Sunday sermons, speaking of the hidden nature of evil and the importance of community healing. Miss Morrison's delayed funeral became a sombre celebration of her courage in attempting to expose the truth, even at the cost of her own life. Her grave, positioned near Charles Ashworth's in the churchyard, served as a reminder that loyalty and honesty, while sometimes rewarded with tragedy, ultimately contribute to justice being served. The institutional responses were swift and practical. Mr. Larkin, the chemist, implemented new procedures requiring written authorization for any prescription modifications, while the bank reviewed its procedures for detecting forged signatures and unauthorized transactions. These changes, while necessary, served as permanent reminders of how trust had been exploited by someone who appeared beyond suspicion. As autumn deepened and the initial shock began to settle into acceptance, Bramley Cross found itself fundamentally altered. The comfortable assumption that respectability guaranteed good character had been shattered, replaced by a more cautious understanding of human nature's capacity for deception. Miss Marple observed these developments with quiet satisfaction, knowing that justice, while it could not restore the dead, had at least prevented further tragedy and exposed the truth that Charles Ashworth had died trying to reveal. The widow who had refused to weep had finally been unmasked, her perfect performance revealed as the calculated deception it had always been. The village would heal, as communities always do, but it would be a wiser, more watchful place. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and the final reflections on a case that had taught them all the dangerous power of appearances carefully maintained to conceal the darkest of intentions. 3 weeks had passed since Helena Ashworth's arrest, and Miss Marple found herself once again in Diana's garden, her knitting needles moving, with their familiar rhythm as autumn settled over Bramley Cross. The village had begun to heal, though it would never quite return to its former innocence. The comfortable assumption that respectability guaranteed virtue had been replaced by a more cautious wisdom about the masks that evil could wear. Timothy had called that morning, his transformation from careless youth to responsible heir now complete. The young man who had once seemed destined for disgrace was methodically working with Mr. Whitman to restore his uncle's affairs and establish a scholarship in Miss Morrison's memory. His gratitude to Miss Marple was touching, though she had gently deflected his thanks with the observation that truth has a way of revealing itself to those patient enough to observe. Dr. Pembroke had also visited, still troubled by his failure to detect Helena's subtle poisoning method. Miss Marple had reassured him that medical science, however precise, could not always compete with an intimate understanding of human nature's darker capabilities. Helena's use of digitalis from her own garden, combined with the modified bromide powders, had been diabolically clever precisely because it exploited the trust that physicians necessarily placed in their patients. The grey silk thread lay in Miss Marple's sewing basket, a tangible reminder of how the smallest details could unravel the most carefully constructed deceptions. She had encountered many criminals over the years, but few had maintained such perfect composure while committing such calculated betrayals. Helena's tearless performance at Charles's funeral had initially seemed like mere coldness. In reality, it had been the mark of someone incapable of genuine remorse for actions she considered entirely justified. Mrs. Clement had stopped by earlier in the week, her role in the investigation having given her new appreciation for the value of careful observation. Her gossip, usually dismissed as idle chatter, had provided crucial insights into the village's social dynamics. Miss Marple had suggested that such observational skills were more valuable than realized, though perhaps they might be applied with greater discretion in future. The transformation in Bramley Cross was subtle but profound. Neighbours who had previously accepted appearances at face value now looked more carefully at the people around them. This was not cynicism, Miss Marple reflected, but wisdom, the recognition that evil could wear the most attractive masks. The village would carry these lessons forward, perhaps making it stronger in the long run. She thought of Helena's final moments of freedom, when the perfect facade had finally cracked to reveal the calculating mind beneath. The woman who had refused to weep had shown her true nature only when cornered, displaying a cold pragmatism that treated murder as merely another problem to be solved efficiently. For years, Helena had played the devoted wife while systematically stealing from the man who trusted her completely, all while planning for the day when his continued existence would become inconvenient. The case had reminded Miss Marple why such mysteries were both fascinating and deeply troubling. They revealed the extraordinary lengths to which ordinary people would go when driven by greed and wounded pride. Helena had not been a monster in any obvious sense. She had been a woman who had convinced herself that her desires justified any action necessary to achieve them. The particular evil she represented was disturbing not because of its brutality, but because of its calculated patience. Charles Ashworth had died trying to protect his nephew's inheritance and expose the betrayal he had discovered too late. Miss Morrison had perished because her loyalty and knowledge made her inconvenient to someone who viewed human lives as obstacles to be eliminated. Yet there was comfort in knowing that truth had ultimately prevailed through careful observation of human nature and attention to details that others overlooked. As evening approached and the garden grew quiet, Miss Marple gathered her knitting and prepared to return indoors. Tomorrow would bring her departure from Bramley Cross, back to her own village where similar mysteries might be waiting beneath the surface of apparent tranquillity. The widow who had refused to weep would face justice, though her victims could not be restored to life. In a world where evil often disguised itself as respectability, such victories provided hope that justice could still be served by those patient enough to watch, listen, and understand the complex patterns of human behavior. The grey silk thread had been a small thing, easily overlooked by those who saw only the obvious surface of events. But Miss Marple had learned over many years that the most revealing evidence often lay in such tiny details, the imperfect stitch in an otherwise flawless pattern, the single thread that didn't belong. Miss Marple smiled quietly as she climbed the cottage steps, already looking forward to returning home where her own garden awaited, and where no doubt other mysteries would eventually reveal themselves to her watchful eyes. Evil had been tidy, but goodness, being humble, had noticed the thread.